All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to Let's Get Real podcast. And today I've been excited for this interview. I've listened to a lot of people, and the big reason, again, of this podcast is we get real. There's real stories. I always say there's real nuggets. And when I heard this man's story, not just his story, who he was as an individual, how he's taken his life and completely changed it, but now looking to change other lives. And a fact that changing a billion lives. I'm sorry, wanting to change a billion lives, man. So, without further ado, man, I'm going to introduce him. He's a husband and father first, which I love the fact that he says that. Entrepreneur, human behavior and performance coach, a professional speaker. I can go on and on, but I'll tell you right now, I've listened to many podcasts of his. It's completely changed my life and my perspective. So I guarantee it's going to change yours. So without further ado, man, Brian, thanks for having us today, bro.
Dude, thank you. God, that was like one of the coolest intros I think I've ever experienced. And for you to like weave in there that you've not only consumed a bunch of content, but the impact it's had on your life. I just want to start by saying thank you. I'm always grateful for ever getting that kind of feedback because it's fuel for me, brother. It just keeps me going. And like you said, a billion lives, it's one at a time, hopefully one to many in many situations, but appreciate it like more than you know.
Dude, absolutely, man. And one thing I love about you is your authenticity. You have an amazing story, which we're going to start with. But I mean, you have a way of when you're speaking to people. My wife and I have listened to you, and I have probably shared at least 10 people your content and your podcast, and every single one says, wow, man, he has a way of captivating and actually speaking to you because it's real and it's authentic. So we're going to get all there today, and I don't want to waste any time, man. But let's get into it completely. Who you are, starting from the beginning. I know the amazing story that I couldn't even imagine going through, and we'll go from there, bro.
Yeah. So what I love is that you actually started with what I always start with, right? I'm a husband and father first. So I have to say that, and I will start right at the story because I know that that's how most people identify and know me. But I will tell you, husband and father is the most important role in my world. And we talked about impacting a billion lives, but I always start by saying, if my wife and my kids are not good, I'll be walking away from everything. So I just say everybody to know that like the billion lives is not more important than the three people that are most important to me. And that says a lot about who I am. So I have to start there. And I just appreciate that you did as well. I'm going to actually ask you and everybody who's listening, unless they're driving, to just close their eyes for 1 second. I'm going to set the stage a little bit and allow you guys to just transport into a different place. Unless you're driving, please do not close your eyes if you're driving. And you'll understand especially why I'm critically important about that here in a second. I want you to imagine going to a store, having a successful shopping trip, breezing through the checkout line. I mean, we know how those things back up. So whenever we get through that fast, and we just know that we got some luck, right? We breeze through, we walk out the door, we feel the sun and the warmth hit our skin. We feel the breeze blow through our hair. And all of a sudden we've got a pep in our step. We're ready to go on with our day. Now you get to your car, you're focused on where you're going next. You reach in to grab your keys to unlock your car and get going with your day. And as you're about to enter the door, you turn your head and you see a truck barreling 40 miles an hour right at you with no time to react. Go ahead and open your eyes. That's where this portion of my story begins. My mom, my brother, and I went to our local Walmart to get a 1-inch paintbrush. And dude, anybody who's known me for more than about 4.5 seconds knows I've got a ton of energy. I talk fast, I walk fast. Like I'm excited for life. And so way back then, right, it doesn't surprise anybody that I was the first one in the car. I wanted to get home and put that paintbrush to use. And as I was standing next to my car, my mom and brother were a few feet behind. This was back in the days before there was key fobs. So I had to wait for mom to literally reach into her purse, grab the keys, stick it in the door and turn it so we could go on with our way. And as I'm standing there, there was a truck that pulls up in front of the store. The driver and the middle passenger get out, and the passenger all the way to the right feels the truck moving backwards. So Joseph, he did what any one of us would do. He scooted over to put his foot on the brake, but he instead hit the gas. Combination of shock and force threw him up on the steering wheel, up on the dashboard. And before you know it, he's catapulting across the parking lot, 40 miles an hour right at us with no time to react. Now, this was August 10th, 1992, 115-degree day in Phoenix, Arizona, 6:10 p.m. He goes up and over the median, up and over the tree in the median, hits our car, knocks me over, runs over me diagonally, tearing my spleen, leaving a tire track scar on my stomach, and then continuing on to completely sever my left arm from my body. So my mom and brother are sitting there. They watch the whole thing happen. They look down, they see me laying on the pavement. They look up and they see my arm laying 10 feet away. Now, every time I tell this story, I always have to give credit to someone who I'm forever indebted to, because my guardian angel walked out of the store at that same time. And she saw the literal life and limb scenario that was in front of her. And I'm forever indebted that she chose to go into action versus turning her head and going on with her day. Because she came over and she stopped the bleeding on the main wound and she saved my life. She also instructed some innocent bystanders to run inside, grab a cooler, fill it with ice, and get my detached limb on ice within a minute to give me a fighting chance of having a reattached arm that might work someday. If it wasn't for this woman, Joseph, I either would not be here with you today, or I'd be here with you today with a cleaned up stump. That's just the reality. So I know you've consumed some of this stuff. You were expecting where that was going to go. You teed this up, but I know that a lot of your listeners probably were not. Mm-hmm. And so the thing I always have to say is, yes, I know I have an extremely unique story. But what's important for us all to remember, and the longer I've been doing this, the more clear I am on this, every single one of us has unique stories. What's important is that we learn to pause and become aware of the lessons we can extract from our stories, and then become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. And we all have the ability to do that. We also all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of other people's stories to shorten our own curve to learning. So there's obviously lots of life lessons that came from this, but that's really one of the foundational stories that really set me on this path of self-discovery and having to overcome a whole lot.
Yeah. And I love what you just said about everybody has their story. One of my favorite quotes is, if you hide your story, you hide God's glory, because there's so many gifts in those pain points.
That's true.
And what I always wonder is, like, you know, can we find them in the pain points? And you found it outside of it. Like, it took you through going through a lot of pain points before you came to this place to realize, for you to actually look back and say, hey, I need to look back at my life, look back at things that I've been through, and understand who I am as a person, because you've been through some stuff, obviously. I mean,
a lot.
Can you go into a little bit of the stuff you've been into? Because I definitely want to get into the nuggets of how you changed and stuff that's going to help people. But this will, I think, help people to understand little things you went through growing up, and then we'll get into the transformation.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the core lessons that I learned very, very early is this concept that I say I learned early not to get stuck by what has happened to me, but instead get moved by what I can do with it. And I know definitively at this point that moved people move people. And so we have to understand our pain, the layers of pain that have developed, and then the associated layers of armor that really start to get layered on top of who we are, so that we really can put ourselves into a position to make sure that we can be moved and move through that so that we can move other people. That happened because I was in the ICU. That happened because I was feeling sorry for myself. That happened because every other family that came up to us after the fact saying, we're so sorry for what happened to you. We're so sorry for what happened to you. What can we help? And we're sitting here feeling sorry for ourselves, myself, my family included, in a small respect. Not that we were taking pity, but in the first few days with such trauma, that's the only way that most people respond. We needed a little bit of clarity, though, from that, because the families were coming up to us, didn't know if their kid was going to live for another 30 days because of the terminal illness they were dealing with. And so, though I didn't know whether or not my arm would be successfully reattached, though I didn't know if I would actually ever be able to effectively use it for practical use, I knew that my life was secure. That's perspective. And I believe that perspective and pain point us at what's important. So I'm a practitioner of pain, and a whole lot of my pain is giving me a whole lot of perspective, right? And so some of the stuff that I dealt with right away, and I think this is probably where you were going with some of the stuff that you listened to, was two things. I come out of the hospital. I've got my arm in a sling and a teddy bear here because my bone needs to be at 90 degrees. My arm needs to be at 90 degrees for the bone to heal appropriately. And I got used to seeing jaws hit the floor, like all over the place. Because everybody would come up to me, they'd see me in a sling, and they'd ask the innocent 7-year-old boy, what happened to you? What'd you do to your arm? Expecting me to say, oh, I crashed my bike in the street. I jumped off the jungle gym. Oh man, I was flying high on those swings and I just soared and well, I landed funny. They were expecting any one of the normal answers that the 7-year-old boy would say, but instead I'd look at them owning my own truth, deadpan in the eyes, and I'd say, I was run over by a truck and my arm got torn off. And immediately the jaw would hit the floor. And then the second thing that would happen is they'd immediately turn and look at my parents. They didn't believe my own story. They were looking to my parents for validation, to justify that what I told them was true. And so my own truth wasn't being accepted from the time I was 7 for a good period of time because people didn't believe it. And the second thing that happened is those very same individuals were viewing me through their lens of what they'd be capable of in my situation, and started telling me what I could and couldn't do. Now, so many of us experience that in this world when parents, teachers, employers, and coaches start saying, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, you should be this, you should be that, you should want this, you shouldn't want that, you should have this. No, definitely shouldn't have that. We get that, right? But it was extreme in my case because literally people were looking at me and assumed that I couldn't do something because of a physical limitation. So I just shut all that down and I created a mental narrative. And my mindset was very, very tough because that's what I was told. Mental toughness, mindset, that's what you got. We hear all that in space, right? And by the way, I don't minimize any of that. It's extremely important, but it's only a part of the equation. But my mindset served me very, very well for about 13 years, which was Brian's good, Brian's strong, Brian's capable, he can do anything himself. And that served me until it didn't.
And do you think, like I was just hearing you say about this, so it sounds like a story you were telling yourself. Is that something that you think people nowadays, as you're working with people, they convince themselves of the stories that they tell
No
themselves?
doubt, 100%. And so
Yeah.
when I say it's only part of the equation, what I recognize is it's not just about a good mindset, right? It's about truly understanding the narratives that are created in our world and understanding whether we're hardwired intellectually or emotionally first, and learning to be able to balance and regulate between both narratives, because by the way, they both lie to us and they both tell us the truth. So yes, it was a protection mechanism. It was a mental and intellectual narrative that I created to protect myself, right? So 100% that was the case. And yes, that's often what keeps people stuck, is whatever layer of protection, whatever narratives they're leaning into that might not actually be in congruence with who they are.
Yeah. And so how do they, like, when I hear you say that, I think about like myself, for example. I know, like I'm thinking, hearing you talk about things you went through as a kid and you were told a narrative. And I know I've always been looking into, and that's why I love these deep conversations of, I look at why I love validation myself. I was like, why do I love to be validated? Like I could do 10 things for my wife. And if she corrects me on being a parent or a husband, I feel like she's like coming at me. And I started realizing I got defensive quickly. So I understand it, that, okay, I wonder why. And honestly, it's come from listening to you. I'm like, it's probably because when I was younger, my dad always corrected me and was telling me that you're not doing this no matter what I told him. Okay.
Yep.
And so I understood it. And then I caught myself still getting defensive. So I said, you know what? I don't need validation. And I wonder if that's sometimes people are like, that's a defense mechanism, or is that the way people understand it? And they say, you know what, I know that's what I struggle with. I know I always think I'm not good enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fall into saying, I don't need anybody to tell me I'm good enough. I believe it. How does somebody know if they're lying to themselves or it's actual facts?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and not an easy one to answer, to be perfectly honest, because it's different for every single person.
Okay.
I would tell you that we often experience resistance and energy drain that shows up as some level of emotion, discomfort, disease in some way when our intellectual or emotional narratives are out of alignment, either with each other or out of alignment with what we are authentically wired. So what I would tell you is that if it is truly there designed to protect them, I think that we in our cores know when the narrative that we're positioning isn't correct.
Right.
We feel it, right? That's why there's imposter syndrome. That's why there's self-worth issues. That's why there's shame. That's why there's all these guilt. That's why there's scarcity that comes into this place. Because, oh, by the way, how often do you see people show up and try to fake it until they make it, right? We hear that in business all the time. Fake it till you make it. Show up. Make sure you look the part, put the right watch on, put the right suit on, put all these things on. Guess what? That's all armor. And it's a narrative to put yourself in a position to convince yourself that you're good enough based on how other people are viewing you. That's the important factor. And so for you, I think what's really incredible is that you have the ability, and this was really cool. And part of the reason I was so interested to come on this call, on this podcast with you, is in our conversations back and forth on Instagram, as we were starting to get to know each other, your ability to raise your level of awareness without simultaneously raising your level of self-judgment is not normal. And I don't mean that like you're an anomaly.
No, right.
A lot of people have that ability, but in most cases, what people realize when they start to understand, well, this is why I operate this way. This is why I'm getting triggered this way. This is why I'm getting defensive, right? Many people just sit there and swirl in that drain of why, instead of shifting to what can I do about it? In your case, what you did, and you just articulated it, you understood it, you started to recognize the patterns, you looked backwards, and you found a root cause that you started to be able to like transfer forward, at least as it related to the patterns in your life, seeking validation. And what you started to realize is that, okay, if I understand this pattern, I understand the historical reason why I used to seek validation, that narrative, by the way, no longer serves me.
Right.
So for you, you outgrew that narrative, but that narrative served you for a very long time because it was something that allowed you to navigate your childhood, navigate your adolescent years. And yeah, it probably caused pain. Yeah, it probably caused damage. But the perspective that you gleaned from that at this point in your life was for you to actually say, I no longer need validation. And so if I notice myself getting defensive, I need to recognize it's my desire to seek validation, confirmation, to say that who I am is good enough. And if I don't need an external factor to tell me that who I am is good enough, then I can recognize that that defensive nature is truly an emotional trigger that's created a pattern, but it's not real to the current moment. And so your ability to start to see that is why you're making the decision to say, I'm going to do this, made sense. Because you did the historical work. You went to the inside. You looked at why it existed there. And then you looked at how that patterned forward. What most people do is not that. Most people say, oh, geez, I've got this intellectual or emotional narrative that I've put up because it's to protect me. But they don't do the work to go inside. They don't look backwards. They don't look at how it's patterned forward in their lives. They don't look at the environments that connect with them. They just then say, like I did at 7, I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, and I can show up and do it. And so it truly is then armor versus transformation and healing. And so in your case, what you did was you healed layers of pain and shed layers of armor simultaneously by better understanding the situations that put you where you are today. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And all I'm thinking about when you say that is, like, I'm in recovery. So one thing I always talk about when it comes to recovery is they have this program and it's just tools. Now, I always say this all the time. I'm so grateful that I went through my drug addiction. I'm grateful I went through the prisons. I'm grateful I went through the pain, because today I feel like it's like necessary, because not only does my happiness depend on it, but the people around me in my life. And when you say husband and father first, that's what I love about you, is because I mean, listen, I'm in business, I do stuff, but when I think of the beginning with the end in mind from Stephen Covey about what are people going to say about me when I die? I mean, when I look at my children and my wife, you can give up everything. And I recall it from when I was broke, I focused on making money. And then when I made money, I was like, this is it, I'm here. And we went through like a family situation. And I remember feeling in that moment, all that money I have in the bank right now cannot solve this problem for me. There's nothing that can solve this problem. And you went through something like that. Can you take us the drive with your wife where you were working that job into?
I love it, man. You've gone deep on my content. I can tell, because the questions you asked, you're taking me to specific stories instead of like just seeing where it goes. And I like that. That's cool. Yeah, man, I absolutely did that. So, the part I didn't really talk about earlier than this, so I'll just set some context, is I truly was conditioned by the world to chase all the what house, what car, what amount of money, right? And I did all that stuff because that's what I felt like was going to give me the validation I needed for myself to be approved and accepted in the world. And oh, by the way, for me, that was to be accepted by myself and in the world independent of my arm. I never wanted to be known for my arm. I never wanted to lead with my arm. And so for 15 years in corporate America, building and scaling a $15 million business with some of my partners, my arm never led. In fact, I was suited up most times, and most people in my world didn't even know it existed. I'd have friends for 5 years and I'd make a comment about my accident. They'd be like, what? And I'd say, yeah, my accident. They're like, what? I'm like, how do you not know this? We've been friends for 5 years. And like, my arm's 4 inches shorter, the hand's smaller. Like, what is wrong? But it just wasn't a part of my normal day-to-day life, even though it always was part of shaping me. I didn't want to be known for my arm. Even in the speaking space, by the way, sometimes I struggle with that. Yeah. But where that went was we built and scaled an awesome business. And I had all the what's I ever wanted by the time I was 27. We were making great money, more than we ever thought we would make. We were in a really good position. I was a partner at a firm. We had done all this philanthropic work. And 5 years prior to this, I was in a place where I had to recalibrate my life because I wasn't living as the husband and father that I always said I wanted to be. So I started coaching and speaking and doing these things based on an external influence 5 years prior. And that was lighting me up and it was great. Summer 2019, my wife and I went away for a weekend. And it was one of those weekends that, like, man, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, we were one. Like, we were just connected. And as we're heading back to pick up our kids, she leans over and she says, honey, how would you feel if you didn't have to go to the office on Monday morning? I was flooded by fear, drowning in doubt, swirling in my shame, like all simultaneously. And I looked over her and I was like, babe, that's a pretty loaded question. Can you tell me more? Like, where are you going with this? And she went on to tell me, now I had some health stuff that took place a few years prior to that. And I'm good now on that side. But she said, I think you let this health stuff allow fear to enter into your world in a way I've never seen you operate. Mm. And she said, I think you've convinced yourself that we need the money, we need the status, we need the prestige of like all this stability, that we need the financial stability, we need this exposure, we need this credibility. And she goes, we don't. She said, I don't care if we live in a cardboard box on the corner. What we need is 100% of you, and we don't have it. Wow. That hit pretty hard. And then she went on to tell me, she said, every day that you live in risk management and play business consulting, she said, you're dying a little bit inside. You don't even see it and you refuse to see it. That hit me extra hard there too, right? And then she continued and she said, but as you've been coaching and speaking for the last 5 years, She said, that's a totally different deal. She said, you come home lit up, you've got energy. And she said, and I also know your capability in that space. And she said, and I also know that you're barely scratching the surface of your potential and you're having nowhere near the impact on the world that I know you want. So she said, why don't we double down on the risk we took? Let's walk away from everything, start over, and go see what impact we can have. And it took me 3 months to like really sit with that and really understand the elements that were keeping me back. And that was when this wasn't the first time, but it was another time that I really had to go deep on my shame and what was actually preventing me from moving forward and why was I doing these things. And so I put the wheels in motion 3 months later with my CEO and my business partners that I was going to execute my buy sell at the end of that fiscal year. And I did, and I walked away, and that's what we've been doing since is just chasing impact. And I will tell you, chasing all the what's of the world caused me to lose who I was. Mm-hmm. So I had all the what's, but I didn't have the most important thing, which was identity, sense of self, connection with who I was. And if I'm not connected to who I am, how the hell am I going to connect with those that are most important to me in my world? Wow. Right? How am I ever going to permeate that through the community, through our associates, through our clients? Like, if I'm not deeply connected to myself, then I'm not living in congruence with myself. I'm not authentic to who I am. So I had to really put in that work. But I'll tell you that today, man, I'm the closest to who I am that I've ever been, other than when I was first born, before any layers of armor started to develop. And I'm living authentically with joy, freedom, and fulfillment in a holistic way in my world right now. And we're re-engineering, we're breaking generational patterns. Like, my creativity has come back, and the impact, man, is just, it's just starting.
Yeah. And it's crazy because you're talking about, I mean, I listen to you and I'm like, you got a gift. I mean, it's obvious. You're probably really good at business too, right? But you have a gift in what you do when you're speaking to people. Because I took a deep dive into your content. I've been listening to a lot of stuff. And anybody that's known you, that I was like, have you heard of him? And someone heard him, like, dude, I love that guy. Man, every time he makes a new post, I love it. So it's a gift there. And there's a part of me that thinks the more you got self-aware, the more you fell into your gift. Like, everybody's always trying to find their purpose, right? I'm trying to find my purpose. What's my passion? What's my gift? And I almost think it's like a reverse. It's like, find yourself first. Does that make a little sense?
Yes, 1,000%. I am a big believer that your purpose typically finds you, but it starts with you understanding who you are. And it's funny that you say that, my purpose and my gift, right? I think it's thank you. I for the very first time in the last period of time, actually recognize it in myself as a gift that I'm trying to hone and condition so that I can amplify that gift to give to others. But I will tell you that to the idea of purpose, man, I had a written purpose for almost a decade. It changed for the very first time in this last year as I've gotten more and more clear on who I am. And so I'll tell you the transition there, because I think it's really important. 10 years ago, when I first wrote down my purpose for the very first time, it literally was, my purpose is to provide love, leadership, financial security, and presence to my family, provide perspective, motivation, and direction to all those around me, right? Like, provide leadership, financial security, and opportunity to those that work for me and my clients. I literally had it outlined, and it was to provide. Now, that's not totally directionally inaccurate, but it just didn't resonate at the same level. I didn't change it for 10 years because it resonated. But in this last year, as I've gotten really clear on who I am, and I've started to actually lean into who I am and my gift, my purpose is very clear and it's very succinct. It's to allow my truth to give others permission to live theirs.
That's amazing.
I don't know what else I could do other than to share what I've got to offer.
Yeah. And honestly, you're doing it. I mean, when you hear your story and what you're talking about, and one thing I love about it is the vulnerability. It's like the authenticity. And I've been recently, talking with young men, talking with guys who are, and I'm looking at the men. For some reason, I've been on this path and I'm looking at, number one, men who didn't have fathers in their lives, or number one, men who didn't have fathers who validated them. So now these guys feel like they have to be macho and be what the world says they're supposed to be, instead of honestly just being real and authentic. Like, hey, it's okay to like have situations that you need to talk about. Let's get real, let's be honest, let's be transparent. I want to also ask you a question when it comes to helping people, because and this is, again, a lot of these podcasts sometimes could be selfish, but I do think it's going to provide value,
Dude, I love it. Dude, I love it. If it's selfish for you, man, that's going to add value to your listeners. That's what's beautiful about it.
Right. Now, your mission is bringing value to other people. Do you ever find, like, I'm always looking at the deep, and you probably obviously go a lot deeper and looking at roots. I'm talking to people, and whether it's family, whether it's people who work for me, or of course, people in recovery, somebody coming out of treatment, 30 days, they're telling me their issues, and automatically I'm like, this is a self-worth issue right here. And I look at them and they're telling me their issue, and I want to go deep right off the bat, or I want to really help them. I want them to see it. Do you ever find yourself forcing yourself to help people that don't want to see it? And you want to get them to see it. Does that make sense? I mean, because you got to have people in your life that you might see the problem, right? And you want them to see the problem, but
yeah. The word you chose is a very specific one that I want to pivot from, because I used to try to force it on people.
Mm-hmm.
And force is never going to be effective. And I will tell you that with force and application in a targeted way, all it does is actually reinforce their armor. It reinforces like their walls and their triggers. And it reinforces oftentimes the self-worth issue, because it's a very delicate thing to bring to attention for someone that they might be struggling in that way. That they maybe have never thought about their worth as an issue. They maybe have never thought about these things. And so I will tell you that, yes, I used to force it. Now I don't. I just won't. Now, why I say that is I will still layer in truth for people when I think it's applicable, when I think it's relevant, and when I think they're open enough to receive it. But I'll tell you what I did is I focused less on how I would tell somebody and more about the space that I could create to hold for people. Because if I can hold space for people so that they can feel safe and protected, I don't have to force anything. They just start talking. And so that's something that I really had to focus on for myself, is how I put myself in a position where I wasn't bringing anything, any armor, any walls, any triggers, anything to the table, but that I could be there to be a strong back and a soft front. So I could hold someone when they need to, but give them a soft place to land. And so I've found a way to exist in my own presence where I think most people recognize that approaching me, they will be received with nothing but objectivity and non-judgment. And so when that starts to take place, people just tend to spill their beans without much prompting, without much need to force. And once they're open, then I can enter. Yeah. And so for me, that's just a stylistic difference in how I've made it. I also will not try to, if someone's not open, I won't try to tell them what they need to hear. Now, if they're a very close relationship, that's different. If it's somebody that I have a deep connection with, a deep amount of love with, I will continue to embed elements in conversation or ask questions or continue to apply thought until I believe they're never going to be open to it. But most people, if you can wrap them with love, wrap them with care, and help them know that you don't want anything from them, you just want something for them, most people you don't have to force because they are so desperately, willingly able and wanting help. They just don't know how to ask for it or how to receive it. So that's where I have to lead.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. I love what you said, creating that space, just for them to be vulnerable and know that this is a safe place to talk about. Because especially in the world today, everybody I think is afraid of self-judgment. And that's why I love what you talk about a lot, because there's a part of me that believes that they're afraid of being judged because they haven't accepted themselves yet. And I know for me, I was a drug addict from 14 to 26. Yeah. I always masked who I was because I didn't want you to see the real me. Right. And then I got out of prison, and I come from a Middle Eastern culture, not my parents' fault at all, but they wanted me to follow the path that they led for me. Mm-hmm. And then that made me also feel like I'm not authentic. That's not what I want. I want to make you happy. And I never wanted to have that feeling again. That's why I always say I hate somebody who's, I don't want to say fake or not authentic. And I don't even like to use the word hate because I feel like I'm judging that individual when I say hate, or negativity or pessimism, because I always just look back at that's what I always was. So I try to avoid that. Now, I want to go into the emotion of handling with people, because you talk a lot about that stuff. And that's something I love, which is about the secondary emotions that I actually want to learn about. I think it'll bring listeners a lot of value. And I'll kind of give us, whether it's an example or something, but if somebody were to talk to me and I feel disrespected, I get angry. That's the one thing I get upset about quick. is like, hey, look, I'm not disrespecting you. You don't need to disrespect me. And then they start to go into a tone, I get angry. And you have talked about where that anger comes from.
Yeah.
Which is the secondary emotion. But go
anger
into
is almost anger is almost always a secondary emotion, not a root emotion. So I'm grateful for the amount of study you've done, at least in the way that I put stuff into the world, because you're like teeing these things up. Like I just get to walk into it. It's great. I dealt with anger for a very long time. And I just unpacked it for the very first time last year because I didn't know I was angry. I mean, literally my anger was buried so deep, it could barely be excavated. And when I discovered it, I told you I'm a husband and father first. The only 3 people who understood the edge and the anger that I had were the 3 people in my house. When I actually started to own it and move through it and started to do the work around it, and I went around and I started to try to repair damage to people in my world and own that I've been dealing with anger, 99% of people were like, what? You have anger? And I'm like, yeah, it's pretty bad actually, right? I mean, it just was like one of those things. And so for me, I think it's really, really important now, regardless of secondary or primary emotions, I think it's important. And we'll talk a little bit about where we're going with this as to how to actually unroot it. But a great example would be for me, anger was a secondary emotion for me to shame. So I think it's important to start with shame because you talked about self-worth a second ago. And shame, I believe, is one of the most prevalent negative emotions that impacts our society. I mean, it's massive and at a toxic level in corporations, in businesses, in religions, you name it, there is a toxic shame component to our culture. Now, shame is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing because it masks itself as anger, as guilt, as scarcity, as worth, as perfectionism, as control, like literally all these other emotions that people are like, oh, I've got a control issue. Well, maybe you actually have a shame issue. Right? Like we need to really understand like how do these things actually transfer? But for me, shame, there's 2 paths. I'm not worthy and I'm not good enough. When you shut that down, you go to the arena and you're ready to go to battle. It's who do you think you are? See, I'd be lying if I said I never lived in this worth place. But for me, it was really over here. I always felt judged for the things that I was doing at a high level to the point that I felt the need to apologize for all the major things I did in my life. I'd pull the throttle back in my life, literally to live smaller so that I would make less people feel a certain way so that I would feel less judged. So, husband and father first. Anger existed. My wife would ask me, hey, babe, what are we going to do with the kids this weekend? Innocent question. But my shame filter would cause me to hear it as, hey, honey, you've not done enough to be a good husband and father in the last couple of weeks. So how are you going to make up for it this weekend? That's literally what I would hear. Not at all what she said. Right? So shame would bubble up because I would feel like I'm being judged for my number one role. And then one of my defense mechanisms was anger. We can push people away. We can create distance. We can stand on our own. We can make sure that we're heard. We can make sure that we're seen and understood, right? When we express with force and emotion, right? So what would happen? I'd get defensive. I'd bubble up. My chest would puff and I'd rattle off the 10 things I'd done in the last 4 days to show that I was a good husband and father, to prove to her that I was.
Right.
That wasn't even what she asked. Right. And so all of a sudden I'm in a position where I've now created damage because my wife now has to put her walls up because she's defending this energy that I'm coming at her with. So what's really important, and we talk about this, we have this inside out method for understanding our emotions. And I'm going to go over it really fast today, brother. But it's really important because this is something we need to do. And I did this last year when we unpacked anger. When I found out that I was angry, I literally handed my phone to my wife and I said, I need you to clear my calendar for the next 10 days. I'm going on the inside out method because I'm going to make a promise to you today that I will do everything in my power to make sure we don't feel the negative effects of anger in our household as a result of me again. In a year, it's happened twice. I'm very proud of that, by the way.
Yeah.
But I had to go inside and really make sure that I did the work. So inside out method is 4 steps. This isn't a 4-step system for success. I give that caveat right out of the gate because this looks different for every single person. This is just a guided path to help you. We first have to become aware of the emotion or emotions that are impacting our life. For me, shame and anger were the 2 primary ones that created the most damage and limited me at the highest level. So I have to become aware of that. I have to be aware that shame impacted my life, how it impacted my business, how it impacted my relationships, how it impacted my sense of self, how it impacted my performance, my health, my connections. Literally, shame impacted every area of my life. So did anger, by the way. I had to be aware of that. I had to really, really be aware of where and how so that I could lean into the fact and actually own externally Yep, I'm someone who suffered from shame. Yep, I'm an angry person. It's not an easy thing to say externally, but we have to be able to be aware of that so that we can own it, which is the second step. Ownership is that we have to literally own and force ourselves to view how we were responsible or what level of ownership we could take for anything related to that emotion, right? How it impacted our business, how it impacted our relationships, how it's created damage, because that's the secondary part of ownership, is that if we create damage, we need to seek repair. I created damage in those dynamics with my wife. I would create damage every time I'd get defensive and have a heightened energy and I'd come off with an edge or a tone, right? Every time I did that, I'd create damage. I created damage with her parents because they would witness sometimes that environment that she was in and certainly would get protective of their daughter. Now, I never hit my wife. Never have I put a hand on my wife or my kids. But guess what? I've got a big energy. I can pour life into people like nobody's business. Imagine that flipped on the other side. I can also rip life out of someone just by the way I look at them with the energy. And so that was what was happening in my house. I'm not proud of that, but I had to own that. And I had to own immediately. When my wife and I unpacked anger, I had to own immediately. So in the first 4 days in that 10-day window, that's what I did. I went out and I reached out to every single person that was close to us, our closest relationships, family, friends. And I started apologizing. Hey, I'm not sure if you've been affected by this or not, but I want you to know that I've recently become aware of this. I know it doesn't make sense that I wasn't aware of it before or now, but I am. And now I'm trying to actually do something about it. So I'm asking for your help to make sure that you can actually hold me accountable on this path. You can help bring to awareness when I'm actually being triggered in this space. The next step, though, is the most important one before we can actually start to move. It's unroot. These first two steps, most people can do. These next two steps are difficult. You did elements of this. I would argue there's probably still some weeds down there that you need to unroot. But the reality of it, my friend, is like, this is the part that most people don't get to. Because we cannot remove these emotions probably ever, but we have to understand the root or source or sources of them. So have you ever done weeding, my friend?
I have, actually. My wife is putting me out there.
Okay. Have you pulled weeds out of concrete, out of like gravel, out of lawn? Like, where have you done it before?
We actually just recently did it out of the lawn.
Okay. Now, cool. So we'll use a lawn example because this is an easy one. And I know how I was. I'm pretty anal, so I would like actually go and try to get the weeds out when I used to do my own lawn. But recently, right, like it just is what it is. But I also remember days when I would look down there and I'd be like, I'm not feeling so like energetic. And I'd look at it and be like, well, it's green. If I just mow over it, it'll just blend into the lawn. Right. Yeah. But I know that for myself, whether we're picking out of gravel or out of the concrete, right? Like so often when we pull weeds, when we pull it, the root stays in the ground. We don't actually get the whole thing out. So what happens? That weed keeps growing back and that root keeps getting stronger, right? If we mow over it, the root continues to grow. Our emotions are no different. The world has taught us to literally reduce, eliminate, or avoid pain. Shut off emotion, put a smile on, show up, make sure that you're a man or a woman, however you want to do that, but literally show up and be tough. Don't allow emotions to impact you. And pardon my language when I say this, and I really like don't even like that I say this because it's not in character for who I am, but there's literally a book out there that's called Fuck Your Feelings.
Yeah.
I hope to meet the author of that just because, and I'm going to read it, not because I want to challenge him, but I genuinely want to understand his perspective, right? I don't get it. We are deeply feeling beings. And so for me, unless we can actually go and effectively get that root out, right? I know how I was when in the lawn, I would literally go get a screwdriver. I'd jam it in the ground and I'd twirl it all the way around to make sure that I could dig up all the all the dirt so that I could get that weed out. Now, it leaves an empty hole in the ground, but that's an opportunity for us in life because it's an empty hole that we get to refill with new patterns, new thoughts, new beliefs, new environments, and new situations. But until we understand the root or source, and we actually do the work to pull it out, these emotions will continue to impact us in a pretty significant way, no matter how aware and own we can get through it. The last step is where it becomes really, really important. We have to be able to move through it. Now, move means how does it move in your body? How does it move through the world? And how do you move through it? So I'll give a couple examples. I gave one shame example that manifested as anger, right? Another shame example, man, I talk fast. I'm loud. I lived in corporate world for 15 years. You know how many times in a business meeting, someone would lean over and be like, Brian, shh, you can't say that loud. You can't talk that fast. Like you need to calm down. And what would happen? I would get unworthy. I'd start to shrink down. I would literally like start biting my tongue. I'd feel like what I had to say wasn't worthy enough. Not my defensive nature that was coming across as anger. It was actually defeat and shrinking. Same emotion, both connected to shame, right? We have to understand how these different emotions move through our body. Otherwise, we have no ability to actually identify them in the moment when they matter. I have 5 or 6 different ways that shame moves through my body. I have 5 or 6 different ways that anger moves through my body. That's 10 different ways that I have to be able to identify when these emotions are happening real time so that I can actually do something about it. So once we understand how it moves through our body, we have to understand how it moves through our world. And what I mean by that is what triggers us, right? I just gave 2 different examples for shame. One, in an environment where I was being questioned because of who I was and how I communicate wasn't good enough. And another is implying that I felt like I wasn't a good enough husband and father. Those are 2 triggers. I have over 50 shame triggers that I'm aware of, and I have over 60 anger triggers that I'm aware of. So when you actually put yourself in this position to understand what these things are, now all of a sudden we have 2 things. How does it move through our body? How does it move through our world? We can start literally matching them and starting to understand that in those moments, that's when we can pause and that's when we get to move through. Because when we can understand when we're triggered, we understand how it's moving through our body and which emotion it's connected to, we can take a breath, pause, and in that moment, ask if what we're feeling is connected to the moment right in front of us, or if it has to do with how our grandpa looked at us when we were 4.
How do you do the work? Like, so when I hear you say the work, like, so for me, and I'm only thinking about the listeners right now. So I had pain points. I mean, I understood that, you know, when I got out of prison, I came home and all I wanted to do was make my dad proud. That was the number one thing. I wanted to make Pops proud. I've been disappointed my whole life. It's time to make him proud. And then I looked at the path that it would take to make him proud. And I was like, I'm probably going to resent him if I follow this path. So I had to be self-aware because number one, I was also afraid of a relapse and I was afraid of going back on drugs. I was like, this path doesn't even lead to an environment. So I took another path. So it always made me had to say, I'm forced to figure out who I am now. You know, I am 26 years old. I've never been sober. Who is Joseph? Let's figure this out. You know, and I'm still on this journey of figuring it out. But there's people right now that I know they're walking through their lives and they're hearing you say that and they're like, okay, I probably do get angry quick and I probably do have that. And yeah, there's probably some shame in my life, but like, I don't know what it is. I don't know where it's at. And they go on. How do they stop and pause and actually try to, I wonder how you do it alone. I usually do it with somebody, someone that knows me. What's your advice to those people?
So what I'm going to say is just to the whole idea of pointing out when someone has this, if someone's not ready to receive it or someone's not willing to put in the work, it doesn't matter what I say at this moment, they're not going to catapult into action. And so that's the unfortunate part, which is also why we don't sell in the coaching and speaking space. Because if someone's not ready to invest in themselves, they just aren't. Now, I'm going to answer the question in a different way because I think it's important to start with that because I'm not the believer that like if someone just says, well, it doesn't matter, they aren't ready to do the work.
Yeah.
But what I would tell you is pay attention. Like legitimately take toll on how you are experiencing life. And are you living more in the positive side of emotions or more in the negative side of emotions? Right? Some people haven't experienced enough pain to give them the perspective to catapult them into action. Regardless of what their path is and how much their self-worth has impacted them, some people really just are not in a place where they understand it. One of our core concepts that you have probably heard as well is this concept of embracing pain to avoid suffering. Mm-hmm. For me, the lack of connection with my wife was developing suffering at such a deep level that I had no other alternative than to embrace the pains required for me to recognize this stuff, put in the work, and do it as real time and as quickly as possible so that I wasn't creating more damage in my world. So for me, there was no other option in terms of the anger other than to expedite the process. Now, I'd be lying if I said I did it all alone. I do a majority of it in my own processing, my own meditation, my own way of doing it, just because this is what I do for a living. And this is how I help people. And these concepts all were created in here. So it's something that I do just naturally and I reconcile. However, my wife is a sounding board. I have 2 coaches in my life. We have a marriage counselor that we've been seeing for 7 years that is a resource that's there. And I have a number of good friends that are sounding boards to me. Because the reality of it is even if I can do 90% of the work myself, that doesn't mean that I'm seeing everything clearly. So I have to put myself in a position to be vulnerable enough to ask for help and to receive the feedback that I get. But I'll tell you in my household, right? This is a great example. I told you what happened with my wife. Literally from the second we did that, we made agreements. We communicated about what this would look like. We talked about how we were going to support each other. And I said to my wife, look, I can't do this alone, right? I'm getting triggered constantly in our household. I can't do this alone. And so what I can be responsible for is the whole part of it. But I have to first make sure that I'm aware in as many moments as possible and I can own in as many moments as possible what's actually happening in the reality in front of me. So if my wife would ask me that same question again, or any other question, and I felt myself get defensive, that's my job to identify quickly that my wall is starting to go up and I'm getting defensive. So now I can literally pause and say, hey, sweetheart, whatever you just said, it caused my wall to go up. I'm feeling triggered and a little bit defensive. I don't think that was what you intended. So can you restate it so I can hear it again? Or if I'm not able to bring my wall back down, maybe we can just pause and revisit this conversation later and start over.
Damn,
we at least eliminate the amount of damage that gets created as a result of it.
Yeah.
And so even if we have to pause, right? And this happened, I can't tell you how many times where I would be triggered and I'd say, babe, there's gonna be moments where I get triggered. And if I react, I'm gonna create damage. But if I respond, I can put myself in a position to be successful. And so I'd get triggered by the kids or the dogs or whatever. And I would literally look at my wife and I'd be like, I need to take 5 minutes outside. Right? I had to make sure that she was on board to hold me accountable, but also give me the space I needed to do the work. Because if I didn't have that partnership, here's what would happen. I'd get triggered. I'd try to take that break. And then all of a sudden, my wife could be like, no, you can't take 5 minutes. Why can't you just deal with it now? Now, all of a sudden, I'm in that same shame cycle. I'm getting further and further defensive. And so you have to not only put yourself in that place of complete awareness and ownership, but you have to empower those around you, the ones that are closest to you, that you can absolutely trust. And you've got to force yourself to have your wall down. Now, here's what happened, though. I ate shit for 4 months. 4 months, I ate shit. I was near perfection in my anger and my ability to identify these things and all that stuff. But what happened is my wife had 14 years of patterns, and all of a sudden she had to get her anger out on me in those 4 months. Right. And so, and I knew that like what had happened in the pattern that created was my fault. I started it. I was the trigger. Now, I wasn't the fault for her triggers and the things that caused her to be reactionary with heightened energy. I'm not that fault. Those are not my fault, but they became my responsibility once I became aware of them and I realized how I was triggering them.
Yeah,
and so
you be vulnerable, which is
that's right. You have to be.
You said that you were vulnerable to your wife, like because I was just hearing you and it hit a light bulb like in my head, and it's crazy because I was gonna one of the notes that I'd taken down that I was gonna talk to you about. You just hit it, which right on path was. I get defensive, then I get angry, and I'm thinking I'm doing a good job because I get angry, but then I do like before I get angry, and then maybe a couple hours later, maybe 3-4 hours later, I know she's mad. I'm like, okay, I have to fix this now. Now I'm gonna go inside and see what happened. Oh wow, I think I really just got mad at her because she didn't like that I told our son not to do that, and I felt like she was telling me I'm not a good dad. And now she's really not seeing all the good I'm doing. So I go to her, but what I've been actually wondering is how do you stop it from getting anger, like almost like before the emotion hits? And I think you just answered it. Unless
it has to be as real time as possible. Because the only way, here's the thing. If you continue to create damage because of your reactions, then there's no established trust to recreate patterns in the dynamics of your relationships. So if I said to my wife, I'm going to do everything in my power to eliminate the need to have anger in our house as a result of me again. And then every time she'd ask me the question, I'd just react and be like, God, no, I don't want to do that. Oh, no, what are you talking about? No, I just did these 4 things the next day. Or I'd look at my kid and be like, stop, right? Like any of those things don't establish trust. Now you can have mistakes, but they can't be the norm.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was about like, at the end of the day, like, here's what I've been trying to do. And this is going to sound a little abstract and esoteric. But I've been trying to put myself from a consciousness perspective in a place where I can be the observer and participant in my life simultaneously. Because in those moments, I can see things for what they really are. I can understand the intellectual and emotional narratives that happen real time. And I can put myself into a position to empower myself and those around me to make sure that we don't create damage. And so that's it. It's in the moment. If I know that my pattern is my wife challenges me on this area, I get defensive and I react. Well, then I better be really, really clear when I get defensive before I react so that I can own it real time. And I can't tell you how much that has impact in the house because it establishes trust. Literally my wife, bro, 4 months ago, 4 months, this was 8 months after we unpacked anger with near perfection in our house. She was still unwinding patterns that were developed in our relationship and communication. And so she would continue to elevate. And I don't say this like to say anything bad about my wife. She deserves to do all that with the damage I created in our house. Like, I'm not even upset about it. It just is what it is. But she said to me 4 months ago, she said, Brian, I didn't even know that you were capable of emoting anything other than anger. And it took 8 months for her to have enough consistency and trust in the way that I would approach it as she's elevating and I'm staying calm. And I'm literally putting myself in a position with open arms to hold her, hug her, move through situations, own where I'm actually having issues, still holding her accountable after a period of time to like the way she's interacting with me, because it is a dynamic we have to pay attention to. But literally almost a year later, our household is a different house.
Yeah.
And it comes down to ownership in the moment, not 3 or 4 hours later.
And you're in tune with the emotion. So like now that I'm hearing it, I'm thinking, man, if people are listening to this, the number one thing I'm hearing is like, when you understand how emotions operate and when you understand where it's coming from internally, you don't think people get so like, I get defensive, or it's, I take things personal. And the more I'm starting to listen, even just to you, or again, recovery started it. This is a deep dive. Also getting into your content makes me want to think about these things. It's all about the emotion. I'm understanding what the emotion is doing to me. I don't have to take things personal, because now your perspective, what you just said was, you don't even think about your own emotion. Now you're thinking about your wife's emotion. It changes your perspective on how other people treat you. You've also said that you had a problem asking for help, and you said it again. I actually wrote that down. And can you tell me, what have you been uncovering? Because I think I see that a lot. I struggle with that. People in recovery are listening to this. And I know that's one struggle most people have, is reaching out for help. In recovery, we say, if you're having a problem, pick up the phone. And the phone sometimes is the heaviest thing in the world, because we have a problem reaching out for help. What have you discovered so far in yourself that you think could bring value to the people who are listening on that?
Yeah, I think for me, and a beautiful question, because yes, I've talked about my inability to receive and to ask for help, but I haven't ever actually had somebody ask it that way. So I really appreciate that question. I think for me, I never wanted to be dependent on anybody. And I think particularly because of my situation, there were so many things that I could have easily become dependent on people for, as I was struggling with one arm to figure out how to tie my shoes and button my pants and like learn how to play sports and different things. And so I think for me, that mental narrative that I created in those 13 years where it served me well, also was what created the pattern of my inability to ask for help. Because I was so convinced that I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, I can do anything myself. That was literally my narrative. I created that narrative and I lived by it. I don't want to do anything alone anymore. And I still recognize now when I feel like I'm in a position to ask for help, but I resist it. Anytime I notice resistance and energy drain in my world at this point in anything, that tells me I need to look deeper. And so when I get to a place where I feel like I might need help, I might need some support, and I'm resisting asking for it, that's a moment for me to pause and evaluate, in this particular situation, is this still connected to I don't want to be dependent? Is it that I don't want to burden somebody else? Is it that I'm ashamed of what I'm about to ask for? Is it that I need to understand, like, why am I resisting it in this moment? Because, oh, by the way, my inability to ask for help has multiple roots as well. Yeah. So I am still working through this, but I will tell you that the more I put myself into a position to be vulnerable, the more I put myself into a position of being authentic. Vulnerability and authenticity to me are the glue that binds human connection. And the more I'm confident in who I am, the less I'm worried that asking for help is ever going to result in judgment by myself to myself or by others to me. Because it doesn't really matter what other people think in those situations for me anymore. And so I don't really have a problem. If me asking for help changes the way you view me, well, okay, I'll have to deal with that. Because at the end of the day, not asking for help is another element of armor. We don't ask because we're afraid of what's going to happen on the other side. We don't feel like we're going to be protected and safe in that environment. And so not asking is just a way to protect ourselves. But you also heard me on armor, and we don't have time to cover it all today. But the reality of it is, armor, we believe, is protecting us, but it's actually creating a bunch of damage in our world.
Yeah. And one of the things you said was, and I literally wrote this down, I had to write it word for word, and I'll let you get into it as we kind of get close to closing, but we could talk for 2 hours, but me and you will continue to talk, man. But it says sometimes people can't hear their internal voice because the armor they created to protect themselves from the world protects themselves from themselves. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I didn't even know I said that.
It's a little bit about the armor, right? But why are they like, I guess I'm looking for the deep, and I'll kind of give a little more context, because you kind of were talking about it, and the context I'm giving is the fact of, sometimes we say, that's just my pride, man. That's just my ego. And we stop there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, we think, okay, I have pride, I have ego, you know, and I'm trying to uncover why I have pride. I care about what people think, and it's the understanding of it. But now that we know that, how do we control that from letting those emotions come out or understanding it? You know, I know we're
yeah. Again, there's a lot of depth in your questions. I have a lot of appreciation for that. What's funny, like I said, I'm gonna go here for a second. I'm just gonna go down a little path, because what you just read sounded really fucking great. And I didn't even know that those words came out of my mouth. Now that is my fundamental belief, but I don't ever re-listen to things that I say or do.
right.
And so it's funny when someone verbatim reads it back to me. I was like, oh, that's pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
You know, here's the thing. And I'm going to cover this quickly because I know that we have a short time frame left. I believe that we as human beings seek and desire four things. We seek and desire to feel safe. We seek and desire to feel protected. We seek and desire to feel seen and understood. And we seek and desire to feel connected. These last two are the things we seek and desire the most, but they don't happen unless the first two do. So what happens in all of these scenarios, right? And even just the quote that you read, this is the truth. Armor does three things. Because when we don't feel safe, what do? We protect ourselves. We protect ourselves by putting armor up. Okay. Now, armor does three things. It's an invisible force field that wraps around us. So how can we properly identify and demonstrate who we are through an invisible force field? Nobody can see or receive us. They can't understand our authentic energy. They can't do those things because our armor is preventing it. How are they going to be able to see through that invisible force field to see and understand us and connect with us? And our armor actually prevents us from actually having the external regulation of demonstrating who we are to the world through our actions, because it prevents us from doing certain things. And so that quote indicates that whole concept, right? Which is literally this idea that our armor, we believe, is protecting us, but it's actually separating us from and severing the seen and understood and connected pieces, which are the most important. The other thing, Joseph, is how long can you hold 5-pound dumbbells in front of you?
5-pound dumbbells, maybe 2 minutes.
2 minutes. 2 minutes would be good, bro. If you did 2 minutes, I think you could probably do 5. You look like a pretty tough guy, right? But here's the thing. What happens with dumbbells when we're holding them right out? We feel it pretty quick. Doesn't take long before they start getting heavy, right? And we literally can't hold them out there forever. They get heavier the longer we hold them. Our armor is no different. We believe that holding it out in front of us is what's protecting us. But again, it gets heavier the longer we carry it, and it actually starts to incrementally crush us. The third thing it does is our armor is a container. Now, some people don't have a lid on their container and others have a lid. Okay, so let's just assume we don't have a lid for a second. It's like a trash can. If you're too lazy to take out the trash, what do? You shove it down in the container. Guess what? That's what the world tells us to do. Don't feel. Show up with a smile on, move fast. And so we are not allowed to allow our emotions to come outside of that container. So what do? We keep shoving them down. But our container only has so much volume and capacity. So if we don't have a lid on it, what happens? Ultimately, it starts spilling over the top into everything else in our world. But those of us that are even more protected and controlled, we actually have a lid on our container. We don't want it to spill out. We think we can control it. We can contain it. We can hold it in there. But the more we put in there, the more pressure that builds up. And guess what? That container is going to explode and create even more damage than those that spill over the top. And so our armor does those three things. It gets heavier the longer we carry it. It separates and severs us from actually connecting at the deepest level and being seen and understood. And it creates damage. But we don't actually put ourselves in a position to recognize that, because we believe if we're safe in this container, then that means we know who we are. No, you don't. If you're behind your container, that is layers of armor that's preventing you from seeing who you are, period.
Man, that's a mic drop. And it's crazy how authentic you are, because it's so funny when you said that. Like, I took some notes because I've been listening to your stuff and I was like, dude, I'm so excited to chat with you. And I'm reading some of them as we're chatting, and I'm looking at that quote and I was like, I wonder what made me write that. There was something I was listening to. And literally, as you talked about, I was like, oh, that's why I talked about it. Because exactly what you just said right now was something that I was like, that is good stuff, man. Well, bro, honestly, we had a 15-minute conversation kind of before this. We've been chatting on Instagram. Dude, what you're doing right now, I told you before, it's a gift. It's helped me 100%. I know it's going to help a lot of people listening to this. I've been sharing your stuff. I just encourage you, keep going. I mean, obviously you're not stopping, but you're living in your purpose, brother. What you're doing is amazing. You brought us value. Thank you for just having this time. And now the best question I want to ask you, man, is how can we bring you value? How can people bring Brian Bogert value?
Yeah, doing exactly what you just did, right? Move people. You sharing stuff, you showing it to other people, it gets more eyeballs on it. It gets more people connecting to these conversations in a way that helps us all get to the core of who we are. And that's what I want more than anything. So, if any of you are listening, if you're on social media, follow me at Bogert Brian on any of these. We actually engage with our followers. We actually like to build relationships. That's how Joseph and I got connected. And so I'm grateful for that. The other thing I would say is, I want to give something to everybody who's listening, if that's okay. We, that to impact 1 billion lives, 99.99999% will never pay us $1. We're very okay with that. We put out a lot of free content that's truly designed to elevate and empower people. You see this as well. There's not a lot of selling in our content. We don't sell stuff. We just put shit out there that we think is going to help people. And so our team worked on something for a very, very long time. We actually developed the first part of our entire online course. We have over 30 minutes of video content, the full introduction on the first chapter of our entire course. We're releasing for free to anybody who wants to partake in it. So if you go to nolimitsprelude.com, you'll get access for that. Caveat right up front. Yes, you give your email in exchange to get access for it. Yes, you're going to get communications through the process of completing those 30 minutes. And yes, when you're done, you'll get 4 emails talking about other opportunities if you want to engage further. This is not an email exchange to get you into a spam email list for perpetuity and in life. It's where we can add value into yours. So if you can take advantage of that, that'd be great. But again, what I said is we need all the help we can get. Move people. I'm just asking you to help move our stuff, our core beliefs, the things that we want to impact through the world so that we can have collective impact of 1 billion together.
Man, dude, I appreciate it, bro. I know some people removed today, just by chatting with you. And thanks just for having your time, man. It's brought so much light, so much value to us. It's going to take me a deep dive. It's a great way to start my day, man. So I appreciate it. Hope everybody listened, got some value out of it. Thanks for getting real with us, guys. And thanks for letting us share.